Mike, everyone. Good evening. My name is Precious Collins. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And before we get started, I just want to, finish my introduction. Hope you hear real quick. But I am a Mountain Ute tribal member. So I grew up in Toyoaki, went to school in Cortez. But I work for the Southern Ute Indian tribe, which is our sister tribe, as the basically prevention specialist under our behavioral health division. And I'm also a co-founder of Ignacio Out Equal Alliance. And just to real quickly give you a quick breakdown, history of what that organization is basic, mainly all queer Indigenous people in Ignacio or from the area here in Southwest Colorado. We kind of came together and decided that we needed some representation and taking up some space in Ignacio and creating a safe space for our queer community members, as well as our Two Spirit relatives. And so we came together and made this program, made this organization. And so we work very closely with Four Corners Rural Youth, which is here in Durango. And yeah, I'm just super happy to be here. Forgive me, I'm a little off kilter. The documentary always hits me very hard. So the second part that I want to acknowledge and give my sincere thoughts and prayers and feelings out to Fred and his family. Fred actually was a friend of mine. We grew up together. He would be the same age as I am. And so I am a little taken back. I tried to take some time out and recalibrate a little bit, but that documentary always gets me. The vision, the photos. I can't do any justice on telling you how awesome Fred was. Fred was everything that they said in that video, but more. I mean, the wit, the sassiness, oh my God. Yeah, and so it always just hits me. And it's true that when we're going through our stages in life, and obviously, you know, he was going through his stages. He had many names or wanted to be called many things. And I just remember calling him girlfriend. He was always just like Fred, girlfriend, Fred, you know, girlfriend Fred, or just Fred. And yeah, so I'm still still trying to reel myself in from that documentary. It always just hits my heart, because it's always something that I think when we experience trauma, right, especially at such a young age, because we were in high school when this happened, it takes you right back to that moment. And so, yeah, I just want to acknowledge Fred and his memory and his spirit, and also his family and his friends that are out there that went through this same experience. So yeah, I just wanted to put it out there. So let's talk about LGBTQ, AI plus Two Spirit. I mean, the acronym actually is very long, and I missed a section there, but you get the point. We have come a long ways in our queer community, but let's talk about our Indigenous community. What does it mean? In that video, you saw the complexities and some of the definitions of what being Two Spirit is. And I want you to to think on a broader level as well, is that just as diverse as our Native American communities are and our tribes, right? Now you add the complexities or the diverseness, I shouldn't say complexities, but the diversity of identifying as non-cisgendered person, whether that's through gender or sexuality. So you add that on top of your culture, your tribal beliefs, and what Two Spirit is, and it can get very complex in a way. And so, but there's a beauty in that, and understanding that it's not just identifying as a male or a female or gay or a lesbian. It's almost, I feel like we're almost the true rainbow, but we're like the brown rainbow. And so I introduced myself. I first want to recognize those of you that are in the room and on the webinar, that I see you. Ignacio Out Equal sees you. Our community sees you. You are seen, you are cherished, you are valued, and you are treasured. We need to hear that more often in our communities, because when we start believing in this, then we're actually creating the space for our people, no matter how they identify sexually or by gender. So I want to throw this out here. We were talking about Two Spirit, and we saw some of the definition in the video, but according to IHS, which I like to go to, because a lot of our people that are seeking out behavioral health or medical services, especially if you're close to a tribal government or a reservation, you're probably going to go to IHS. And so I wanted to go, in that sense, for Indian Health Services. So I wanted to see what their definition for two-spirited is. And according to that website, it's traditionally Native American two-spirit people were male, female, or sometimes intersex individuals who combine activities with both men and women with their traits unique to their status as two-spirit people. And that's very, I feel like that definition is very minimal. Like I said, it can get even more complex than that, but according to IHS, that is the definition that they landed on. And so uniquely, two-spirit people are different depending on their tribe and their people, their community. In ways that they are different is the terms that we use. We saw some of the terms that the Kiowa, the Dene people use. For us youth people, there actually is a word, but I don't know it. There's a word out there, but we're starting to reclaim those identities. We're reclaiming our space. And so the terms, and even in some Native American communities, they're starting to reinvent what that looks like, because they lost it. And so they're reinventing these terms for people that identify as being two-spirit. The work roles, the societal roles differ, the gender variations differ, as well as the spiritual sanctions. What does that look like in your community, in your tribal people's way? And then also same-sex relationships also differ as well. So where are we? Why aren't we represented on this? Y'all are familiar with this, right? Have you seen this before? It's kind of the breakdown of what some of LGBTQI, QQIAAP, right, plus. We don't see two-spirit up there. It's just because, well, let me ask you, why do you think we're not up there? Visibility? Yeah.
To just as the film suggested, it wasn't until like the late 80s or early 90s when the language two-spirit came about. So when I was a undergrad in late 90s, I went to school where we just had LGBT, and that was it. So if that language of two-spirit barely beginning, and we're already invisible people, it's gonna take years for that language to be present and be seen alongside all of these other languages.
Yeah, you're correct. I think that there's a combination. There's no right answer, right? There's a combination of why our Two-Spirit is not represented in some of the queer marketing or symbolisms that we see today. We're not seen. Much of what we're talking about today with SASO's Symposium this month, right, is violence against our Indigenous relatives. So the murdered, missing Indigenous relatives, we talk about being seen, and we're not. And that's even just for our cisgendered relatives. And so now we add on our queer relatives, you know, they're really overlooked. And so, yeah, and you're right, you know, in Canada, actually, I think that's where the Two-Spirit term came from, it was at that time in the 80s in Canada. So America, right, and I think it's just because of American culture, and I'll talk about that later on, where we actually closed the doors back in the 80s and earlier. And even today, we're still seeing that, where we closed the door and we shut out any diversity or the questioning of diversity, because it's not the American way, right? So you can see here that, and this is very minimal. Explain that, very minimal. This actually breaks down a lot more. It gets a lot more diversified here. But if you are not familiar and you're looking at this and you're going, oh wow, look at that, cisgender, you either identify as male or female, queer gender, intersex, transgender, female to male or male to female. And then even in sexual orientation, what does that look like? I've never seen this before. I didn't realize there were so many. I challenge you, if you look at this and you think that, to go and dive into this, because it even gets even more complex. It really does. And our youth, especially, are educated on this. They're very aware of this, of how actually the rainbow, how far it goes, and the different shades of color. They are very well educated on this. I sit on a committee on sexual education, and it's really nice, especially for me, to see some of our youth that are involved, and they educate us on this. They'll call us out and call out the policies and procedures that need to be updated because the language is outdated. So I encourage you, if you were looking at this and you're going, oh, that's a lot, it actually isn't. This is very simplified. So I do encourage you, if you see this, to dive into it more if you're more curious, and finding ways you can be educated so you're respecting other people's identities. I think is beautiful. And also too, if you're questioning your own, these graphics, these graphs such as this can help you identify, or at least name, how you felt, or maybe a friend or family is feeling, or how they express themselves, either through gender or sexual orientation. And so according to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, because my background is behavioral health, I wanted to talk about some of the risk factors that our queer people, but specifically also thinking about our Indigenous queer people might be experiencing. And so already nationally, we know that our queer people in general have a higher risk of experiencing harassment and violence across this nation. We also definitely still see these social stigma and discrimination. We also know that because of this, we have an increased risk of various behavioral health issues. So we got to keep in mind those risk factors that exist in our community and label them, be aware of them. Because the only way that we can change them is when we identify them and we call them out for what they are, right? For example, if I know that my health is declining, I can look at myself and say, I know I'm not working out. I just had like a cookie and I'm drinking pop, right? I know my risk factors. I need to call them out. Because if I want that change, then I know what I need to do. So it's almost the same type of mentality. So when we're talking about creating, later on, we're going to talk about creating safe space for Indigenous relatives. We need to be aware of what those risk factors look like in our own community, and even with our own selves. And so what can this look like? When we're talking about harassment and violence, we can break it down into two different things here. We can break it down into interpersonal violence, which is defined as an intentional use of physical force or power, threatening or actual against another person, resulting in or against a group or community that results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. We can also break it down into collective violence as well, where violence is committed by a larger group of individuals and can be subdivided into social, political, and economic violence. We always overlook that. I think within the past few years, we're starting to recognize that collective violence. And in our queer community, we've actually known about that collective violence for a while. We have. So I just want to point it out that there is different ways that our queer relatives can be experiencing violence and abuse. It could be by their family, their friends, or it could be by society, right? And how does this show up? Well, when we break it down further, we can see here that self-directed violence, right, in the form of suicide or self-abuse can take form of physical or psychological or even neglect. We can neglect ourselves. We can neglect ourselves. And so we have to look at ourselves individually, and hopefully our family and friends recognize this as well, that maybe we need added support, whether it's from our own relatives or maybe we need a professional help, right? And we go further into interpersonal violence committed by either a family member or a partner or by the community. But let's look at the family and partner section, because we tend to overlook this. This is important. We overlook this, that our own children can be the abuser as well. Take for instance, if let's say, I know some queer people who, for whatever reason, maybe it was because they needed to conform or they felt like they needed to conform. They had a heterosexual relationship and produced children. But then later on down their life decided, I'm not happy and I need to be my true self. And they might experience abuse from their own child. They might experience violence, physical violence, verbal abuse because of that decision. And that's just an example. But there, on the other side of it too, queer children can experience violence and abuse because of how they identify. And across this whole graph here, you can see both physical, sexual, psychological, and neglect on all levels. In our community, we can also be abused or a victim by an acquaintance or a stranger. And collectively, again, we forget about that section, that we can also experience that abuse and violence through our communities, politicians and politics, right? Right now, I think we got the Equity Act, or Equality Act, correct, Equality Act, right? So if you haven't, please look into that and support the Equality Act. But yes, I want to make sure that we're pointing that out. As far as collective is concerned, we can experience that type of violence and abuse. So how many of y'all, raise of hands, have seen the healthy relationship wheel? You all familiar with that? Yeah, right. All right, so we talk about what healthy relationships look like. Well, let's talk about LGBTQ and the power and control wheel. It's very much similar to what a healthy relationship will is, but it just breaks it down into the different ways that a queer person might experience violence and abuse, depending on heterosexualism or homophobia, transphobia, and then we're breaking it down into how that might show up. We can see that maybe, for example, if we are experiencing abuse in our own family, if we're experiencing isolation and they're controlling what we do, don't tell people that you're gay. Don't tell people that you identify as being Two Spirit. That's a form of control, right? We need to be aware of this stuff. Be aware of your actions. Be aware of our words and how they show up so that we can identify where this is coming from and change it. And so if you're interested in this will, you can definitely Google it and it shows up, but it's Rowan Jagorsky will. I think there's a couple of other different ones out there, but this one here I picked because it aligns fairly well with our healthy relationship will that we use in behavioral health when we're talking about teens, talking to teens, especially about what healthy relationships look like, right? So queer violence and abuse and reporting. You can see that when we're talking about how this shows up and what healthy relationships look like. We also need to recognize that queer people, Indigenous queer people especially, might not want to report. And there's a few reasons why, right? As Indigenous people, not even identifying as being queer, but just in general, Indigenous people don't usually report. They don't report abuse. They don't report because of the lack of respect or maybe follow through law enforcement, right? Or social services or whatever, medical assistance as well. So now queer Indigenous people, for the fear of maybe even being ousted, right? Or fear of being ostracized from the community. Now, keeping in mind how important you are to your own Indigenous community. We're usually a tight-knit community, and now you throw on that, I don't want people to know I'm queer. They might think that I'm a predator. There's all these different factors that play in that our queer relatives, Indigenous queer relatives, might not report. So I do want to make sure that you keep that in mind when we're talking about queer violence and abuse and reporting, is that there are reasons why our queer relatives might not report what is going on to them, or maybe even what they're seeing. We have some Indigenous people in the room today, and I want to throw it out there, right? BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs. We have jokes on reservations about them, right? We do. We laugh about it because we know, right? And that's just some of you might be heterosexual Indigenous people, and you already know what I'm talking about. Now, couple that on top of being a queer Indigenous relative, they really might not want to reach out to BIA, right? Because there might be a fear of being judged. And that can also too be a form of abuse too, because a police officer might show up and say, well, I know you're gay, or, or they caught someone with someone else. They could use that against them, right? And so we want to be very observant of that. And when we see that kind of misuse of power, to report it and call it out. That is us being good relatives to one another. Another one that I really want to hit on here is this lack of resources or belief in them. We got to get to the root causes of some of this stuff. When Indigenous communities, sometimes we have a bad experience, or our families had bad experiences with some of the resources that are supposed to help us. And because of that lack of resource or that bad experience, it carries on. And so we become untrusting of that resource, right? And so really making sure that if you are a organization or you work with an organization that is providing resources, especially to our queer Indigenous relatives, to stand by your word, right? Be responsible, take responsibility, and be have that humility to meet the needs of our queer Indigenous relatives and let them know that they are seen, they are heard, and you're going to help and support them. But also to be honest with them, you know, keep that good communication with our people, because if we're kept in the dark, you know, that's just going to add to us not believing in them, right? And that support. So I really do want to make sure I call that out, particularly for our queer Indigenous relatives and seeking out resources. If you experience something like that, to definitely report it. You know, I think that's too, is when we experience a bad a service or someone does us wrong, we internalize it. We don't want to report it, but I do want to make sure and say, yes, you need to report it, because that is the only way change happens. That's the only way change happens. I also wanted to talk about our a lot of our two-spirited relatives that are experiencing some sort of violence or discrimination, even against our own people or with our own people, identify as being trans, the male to female or female to male. And just nationally here, this is a fact. You know, our transgender people, they experience a much higher rate of physical and sexual abuse, whether that's interpersonal or by the community. And that includes government officials, home, and then people on the street. So transgender people already are experiencing a higher rate of abuse. Now, this is one point that I want to put out there as far as our Indigenous people. Our Native American males who are identify as female, they're getting judged by our own people, our own Indigenous relatives, for that in the American culture. And when I say that, right, the machismo, if you are seen as being a male and you identify as being female, you are then seen as a sissy, right? And the same can be seen or said for female to male, but the American culture puts another label on there as a male or a female to male as being strong, right? I have always been more masculine presenting. I used to have short hair. You know, I really idolized one of my uncles, and he was gay. And he used to have like he used to shave the side of his head, you know, and he was female presenting. But I really liked that. I was like, oh, I want to shave my head, and I used to get misgendered all the time. But I experienced a different kind of label than my uncle. My uncle had to be strong, right? Our Indigenous two-spirited male relatives that are identifying or come off as female presenting, they have to be strong. They really do, because they do get attacked even by our own community. And so I didn't experience that in my community. If anything, I was praised for being able to do what my boy cousins could do, but more, right? It was like, she's not crying, why are you crying? You're supposed to be tough, you know, going hunting. If my male cousins were crying around about not, or they're hungry or making noise or whatever, right? And then they get judged against me. And I was like, oh, that's cool, you know? But we don't do that with our male, female presenting relatives, our indigenous relatives. We don't, it's the opposite, right? We judge them, we discriminate against them, we put labels on them that they don't deserve. And I want to call that out. I really do. I want to call that out. One of our other co-founders, he likes to say he's also indigenous, and he's a gay male, but he likes to say he's a queer or minority within a minority, because he's indigenous, but he also identifies as being a gay male indigenous person, right? And I can relate to that, but I think his also goes a step further because he also gets judged by his own people, right? Or he could have been judged by his own people. And so I really want to state that out, that in general, yes, transgender people definitely do get discriminated against, and are at a higher rate of being experiencing violence and abuse, and that goes for our indigenous relatives as well. So what can we do about it? What can we do about it? Number one, intersectionality. Everyone is humans. Everyone, every single one of you in this room, including myself. Some of you, we might align because you're indigenous, I'm indigenous, cool, right? We don't come from the same community. We definitely don't come from the same family, right? We're so diverse even within our own communities, right? My grandmother that raised me, you know, we might share some blood, but she had a different upbringing than I had, right? And so if we can really understand and be humbled and respectful of this in everyone, it's a good start. It is a good start. I mean, we're not even throwing in there, I mean, you could, because gender is a part of it, right? And sexuality is a part of it, but even just in general, just be human, recognizing that we're all experiencing life in different ways, right? And being humble about it. Another way that we can make some change in our communities for our queer indigenous people is do the work. Do the work. I'm not even just saying if you're a part of an organization or a program, trauma-informed, right? I'm talking about you just as an individual being trauma-informed. And if you're going, oh, what is that? I don't know what that means. I really do challenge you to Google it, research it, because I feel like that's trending right now. It is. There's free trainings out there. I'm a part of the La Plata County Suicide Prevention Collaborative, and the trauma-informed care that Dodie with Resilient Colorado offers is now looking into a culturally trauma-informed care. And I'm proud to say that she's reached out to me. She's reached out to different other people that have different backgrounds and diversity, look different than her. They sound different, right? That intersectionality, class, and race. And she's doing the work. She's like, all right, what does this look like? I want to be super respectful of what this looks like for the people I'm training. Another way that we can do that is do no harm, right? My grandma used to say, if you don't have nothing good to say or nice to say, don't say it at all. I think a part of that was, don't do harm, right? If you have a question, then be very sincere and ask. That's fine. If you're not quite sure about someone's gender or sexuality, ask. There's a whole, if you go to GLAAD's a good one. If you go to GLAAD, there's a whole section that helps you with how to ask about someone's pronouns, why pronouns are important. Right, how someone identifies, and even educating yourself that if this person looks male presenting or masculine, don't assume that they are or they go by male pronouns, right? And the same for female. Social justice, where are we at with that? Be aware of it. because it plays very much into what we're talking about today. Equity and diversity and inclusivity, this whole Jedi, right? The whole work of Jedi in our organization. We are now calling out systems change. We're calling out discrimination. We're calling out old oppressive ways and practices. And we're saying no more, no more. Not only just for Indigenous people, but now we need to say no more for our queer Indigenous people. And I'm looking at my queer relatives in here. Call it out. Right? We're the ones that are usually doing the work on our reservation and with our community. Call it out. We also need to make sure that we're holding ourselves to the standard. That is definitely a good start. Another way that we can make change is creating safe spaces. Right? Creating safe space. Even if it's in your own home. Even if it is in your own home, our Indigenous people that are going home today, you have Indigenous people or relatives or friends that might identify as being queer or two-spirited. And I say these two things separately because they could be questioning and trying to understand what it means to be two-spirit. Because there is that cultural piece that sometimes being a two-spirit might incorporate. And let's say you're Indigenous, but you didn't grow up culturally, you didn't grow up traditionally, you don't know what that looks like, and so you're afraid to call yourself two-spirited, right? So I want to leave room for that. So our queer Indigenous relatives or our queer two-spirit relatives, we want to create space for them, starting with us in your own home. Build it out to your community. When you go to have family functions, what does that look like for them? Does it mean that you're putting up a little two-spirit flag? I love it when I see flags, pride flags. It makes me feel welcome. I go to a family function and I see that, oh man, that's cool, right? There's some space, but you also too aren't just going to throw it up to say, I welcome you and I accept you. No, you're going to actually have to practice this stuff. You have to practice it. It's not just about using pronoun pins or pride flags. You have to practice this stuff. So we want to welcome people as they are, use their pronouns, communicate clearly and in a healthy manner, right? Don't be afraid to ask questions. Like I said, don't be afraid to ask questions. Be curious. Support and encourage engagement and empowerment. If they come out to you saying that they experience a negative experience, ask them, support them. How can we help them rectify that situation? We don't want to do it for them, right? But we want to help them and encourage them. And the same thing when they're wanting to pursue something good in their life, help them, support them, be good relatives to them. And then if needed, provide good information. If needed, provide and find emotional support resources. Be an advocate, be an ally. Right? I put if needed because sometimes that's not needed. Sometimes, sometimes we get over excited and we go, wow, you know what you should do, right? Our parent or our grandparent or auntie or uncle side comes out and says, well, back in my day, or right? Well, let's just be curious first, right? Ask questions, and if they're asking for advice, then yeah, give them advice. But also acknowledge too that they're on their own journey, and it's probably separate than yours. But we definitely want to make sure that we're being good allies to our relatives. And another way, this one here is important. You don't need any kind of training. Well, you could take training, but I think this is just being a part of being a decent human being. Be a safe person, right? Listen. Actually listen to people when they talk to you. Our queer relatives, our Indigenous queer relatives, sometimes they don't feel like they're being heard. They're not being seen, definitely from the community sometimes. And so if they're not being seen, do you think they're being heard? No. So let's make that space for them, show them that you see them, that you hear them, and that they matter. We want to validate their feelings. We want to stay away from the typical, it'll get better. This is just in general, like I teach suicide prevention, right? We stay away from that. It'll get better. It's okay. You're going through it. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Oh, I heard that recently. What does that mean? How long is this tunnel light? Because I don't see no light, right? But in a way, it is true though, because I see my light. I had to create my own light, right? And so, how do we help them create that light, right? So we want to make sure that we're staying with some I statements, stay away from judging them, right? So I believe in you. And then this one too is, I really debated on adding it. That sounds like a really hard thing to go through. I feel like in behavioral health, that's like one of the go-tos for us. And I'm like, it's become so robotic. But yeah, so figure out what that means to you. And if you speak your Indigenous language, learn how to say that in your own way, in your way, right? Because a lot of our, I don't know if we have fluent speakers here, but a lot of our Indigenous languages, when we try to say things like in the film, Fred's mom was talking about how that in English, it's hard to talk or label or talk about something. But in Navajo, Dene, Fred understood because she talked to him like that, right? So figure it out on your own way, in your own community, your own culture's way, your people's way of connecting and validating someone's feelings, right? Express concern, so tell them and be sincere about it. Tell them, that you care and be sincere about their safety. It's just not temporary. If we love each other as human beings, we respect each other, we see each other for human beings, it would, even though I might not know some of you, tomorrow, if you weren't here, it would hurt me. Oh, that person was in that symposium, in that presentation, right? And even the people that aren't here, it still hurts our community as a whole. So we want to validate and express to them that they do matter, right? So I am concerned about you. I'm concerned about your experience. I'm concerned about things that are happening to you. And for the sake of if they did disclose that they were experiencing an assault or violence, don't ask for details. I think it's in our Indigenous community, it's as Indigenous people, and you might be thinking, well, why is she laughing? And there's memes out there, but if you, right, there's always those people that are wanting to know everyone's business, right? We don't want to be that for our people. If we really want to create space, especially for our queer Indigenous relatives, don't ask for those details. If they disclose something, then that's on, that's them disclosing it. But we don't want to be asking them about what happened. If we're curious about what happened to them, be more curious about how you can support them, right? How can I support you? Who do you trust? So helping them find a trusted professional or an organization such as SASO, right? Yep, they are a trusted organization, and help them connect to that organization, because then they can share that details. They're trained, they're professionally trained to deal with these situations, right? Because sometimes, and I'm just speaking from experience, when we know too much, sometimes because we're not trained, we might let that slip down the road later on with relatives or friends or the community. We don't want to do that to our people, because then that goes back to them not wanting to reach out for help. I'm not telling you nothing no more, because you got big mouth, right? That's what they say. And at least in my community, say, "Damn, you got a big mouth," so you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. So for your own, even for your own good, just try to stay away from the specific details. But I think the key here is that if they're experiencing that violence or assault, you definitely want to get them to appropriate resources. So with that, is there any questions? I kind of went through that pretty quick. Yeah. I think I went through it really quick. But do you have any questions on Indigenous queer relatives or violence and abuse that they might be experiencing, whether it's you know, even from our own people or from outside community?
Your take, given the context of the first movie that this shows, and what I've learned that, you know, Two Spirit folks are really veneered and honored in Native, traditional Native cultures, right? But then I also grew up in Native communities that really had a lot of homophobia and teasing and bullying LGBTQ communities. I was wondering what your take is on that. You know, is that just for maybe some of our communities aren't aware that these are really kind of spiritual people? Is that a part of colonization, or is it part of like you know, kind of internalized hatred types of things? Curious about your thoughts on that. So
I think right in the documentary they talk a little bit about that, about the historical events that happened to Indigenous communities across this whole continent, not just here in the United States, but up from the, you know, tip of South America all the way up into the glacier country, right? The experiences of historical events such as boarding school, colonization, right? The religious influences, the foreign religious influences on our people and our land. To answer your question about why some communities uphold and still have that connection and belief and place for our queer relatives, our Indigenous queer relatives, versus those communities that don't, I can't clearly answer that, because I feel like we've all came through our own journeys as different peoples, as different tribes, through all of that history of change. And so when we're talking about history of change, the religious belief systems, the even influences from other tribes changed our way of living. One thing that I always fall back on is that if we as Indigenous people truly believe in our connection to Creator, Creator doesn't judge. It doesn't judge us on our gender or how tall or short or, you know, how we sound, the way we look. It doesn't, is in our language, right? And in English, it's kind of hard to say this, but it's what's in here, right? And I think what I'm starting to see a lot of, and I always say this, some of you might not already have heard me say this, but what's trending now, that word is energy, right? So as us, as people, as this, me standing here in front of you is what the Creator created right here. And so we can't judge. What's a part of me is a part of you, right? That tree that's made up out there, I'm made up with that same thing, And so I always talk about this because people always come to me sometimes to say, well, I'm looking for like cultural connection. You know, where can we, because in our program, our Native Connections program, we talk about culture as prevention, right? And a lot of our Indigenous youth are disconnected, not even just our youth, people my age and older are disconnected from our culture, right? And so some people say, well, how do I reconnect to that? My answer is reconnect to Mother Earth first. Because you're gonna find those answers through there. No one is gonna judge you on your sexuality. Mother Earth ain't gonna judge you on your sexuality or your gender or how you look or how you sound. It's gonna judge you on how you treat it, right? That person lists and how I'm using my power and my energy. I think that's the core of it. So as Indigenous people, if we believe in that, we probably shouldn't judge one another. You know what I'm saying? We do. I see some of these meetings, I see and even we get revered for our still being connected, standing up for water, standing up for Mother Earth, right? And then we go home and we maybe judge our relatives that are queer. That's not good. That's not good. I can see judging someone for harming someone. You can judge someone on that. Like, you're not being a good person, you need to change. Okay, I can see that. But because you are different and you prefer same-sex relationships, or you might look different and you're supposed to look a certain way, there's no way to judge them. And I don't think as Indigenous people, if we really truly say that we're Indigenous, we probably shouldn't judge one another on that. Because now there's this big movement on decolonizing our thoughts, our actions, and our words as Indigenous people. If we believe in that, then we need to also decolonize our ways of treating our queer Indigenous relatives. That is a big part of it too. Don't leave out part of the pie. You want the whole pie, you need to do the work on the whole pie, not just pick and choose. So thank you. I went on a little rant on that. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, no? What, no?
What's the difference between Native and Indigenous? What's the difference?
The terminology?
Yeah.
That differs, right? Because you got Native Americans, and I'm sure you can speak to this. You got Native Americans, which is generally used for Native people that are native to this American country, right? And then you have American Indians, which for a long time we were called, but no longer called. And then you go Indigenous, which encompasses every Indigenous community and people from the tip of South America all the way up north. So when we say Indigenous, that includes our brothers and sisters to the south and our brothers and sisters to the north. That's everyone. And so we could say Indigenous to America, right? So it just depends. The terminology is starting to change. I know Johns Hopkins changed their center to meet the terminology needs, because it used to be American Indian Health Service, or you used to use American Indian in there, and now it's Indigenous. I think is their what they're calling their center. Yeah. I hope that doesn't make sense. People still use them interchangeably.
I could add to that. In the past, Native peoples are like natives. It was like anthropological way of referring to Native peoples, and it kind of had a connotation of being primitive. So oftentimes in old scholarship, you'll see natives, but a lowercase n and then s. So when we say native, we really mean capital N. We're trying to insert humanity and personhood back into that use of native. And I sometimes feel like it's a term that Native people use amongst ourselves as natives. And so I think it's kind of like a project of reclaiming that word from anthropologists and early ethnographers to say we are natives, but again, preferred, I think we're leaning towards Indigenous, so we're inclusive and not just bound by the U.S. borders.
How about New Zealand or Australia, or places outside of the Americas, Indigenous, or you see that as a separate thing?
Indigenous covers, indigenous peoples of, Australia and New Zealand. But for indigenous peoples there, they, tend to go towards like aboriginals would be another term as well. Or in New Zealand, Maori, so they tend to be, at least in New Zealand, a little bit more, I guess, monolithic in some ways, in that there is like an accepted term of being mountain.
So if you think about it, right, indigenous, you could use even yourself as you being indigenous to a certain part of land and country, right? Just like I'm indigenous to this land, I'm indigenous to Colorado, more specifically, right? Or I'm indigenous to the Shining Mountains, more specifically, right? That's where my people come from. But I wanted to add on there too, that Native is starting to get used in other ways, because I've seen the Colorado license plate sticker and it says Native, and I'm like, oh, there's a Native, and then I drive by and it's not a Native. It's not a Native. It's not a Native, right? It's like, oh, I'm native to Colorado. Oh, are you? Welcome to my land. Right? It is though. So we're starting to see that not only us reclaiming Native, but other people are claiming Native because, well, my grandmother, you know, or my people or my family's been here for 2 generations. Oh, that makes you Native. You know, it's like Native squared. We could start adding equated like mathematics to it. So what is the root of Native? I should make that a shirt. The square root of Native is me. But yeah, so thank you. This is my presentation and I appreciate it. Thank you to SASO and Kelsey for inviting me out. I definitely want to give a shout out to all the indigenous people out there that are doing this work, because it's not just our organization. There's tons of other indigenous people, especially queer indigenous people, that are starting to come out on social media, and they're calling all this stuff out. They're saying, hey, here I am, here's what I look like, this is my experience. And then there are also too plenty of resources and programs now that are starting to say, hey, we need to make Two Spirit a part of our resources. We need to utilize that terminology. We need to educate even our own people on it. And so I encourage you all, especially those of you that are visiting from other communities, go back and really identify, you know, even if you don't have a queer organization in your community, identify those champions in your community and say, hey, how can I help you with this? Because I think this would be awesome. I want to know more, and our community needs to know more. We need to create space for our queer relatives, indigenous queer relatives. So thank you. Appreciate it. Go ahead.